Today, we're re-looking at President Donald Trump's announcement of a new initiative he calls the Board of Peace. Trump has presented this body as a way to support ceasefire efforts in Gaza and, potentially, to address other global conflicts. He argues that existing international systems are too slow, too bureaucratic, and too ineffective at ending wars. The question is not whether the idea is ambitious, it clearly is, but whether it can realistically function alongside, or independently of, existing international institutions. So what is the Board of Peace? According to Trump, the Board of Peace is intended to bring together global leaders to broker faster, more decisive peace agreements. He has described it as a high-level forum focused on deal-making rather than prolonged diplomatic processes. At its unveiling in Davos, Trump said the board would work with the United Nations, although leaked draft documents have led some observers to question whether it could eventually overlap with, or even replace, some UN functions. Several US allies, including the UK and France, have chosen not to participate for now. One commonly cited concern is the inclusion of leaders such as Russian President Vladimir Putin, whose ongoing war in Ukraine complicates perceptions of neutrality. Supporters of the initiative argue that the current international system often struggles to deliver results. From this perspective, the Board of Peace reflects a preference for leader-driven diplomacy, where decisions are made quickly at the highest level rather than filtered through multiple institutional layers. Some see this as an extension of the idea of peace through strength, where US leadership and leverage are used to bring parties to the table and impose clarity on negotiations. Supporters argue that in conflicts like Gaza, where multilateral processes have stalled, a smaller, more flexible forum could help unlock progress. They also point out that international diplomacy has historically evolved through new institutions when older ones were perceived as inadequate. Critics focus first on institutional overlap. The United States already conducts diplomacy and conflict management through the State Department, the Pentagon, intelligence agencies, and multilateral forums like the UN and NATO. From this viewpoint, a new board risks duplicating existing efforts or creating parallel diplomatic channels. That could complicate coordination rather than streamline it, especially in fast-moving conflict environments. There are also questions about how the board would interact with existing legal and diplomatic frameworks, particularly when those frameworks already define ceasefire monitoring or peacekeeping roles. But what about enforcement and legitimacy? One of the major issues raised by analysts is enforcement. The Board of Peace does not appear to have independent authority over military force, sanctions, or peacekeeping deployments. Like many international forums, any agreements it helps broker would depend on the willingness of parties to comply. Observers note that without enforcement mechanisms, compliance often hinges on political incentives rather than binding obligations. Legitimacy is another concern. Because the board would be created by presidential initiative rather than by treaty or legislation, some governments may question whether its commitments would survive changes in US leadership. Peace agreements tend to last longer when all parties believe the process, and its guarantees, will endure beyond a single administration. Trump's personal diplomatic approach also shapes perceptions of the board. His style has often emphasized direct leader-to-leader engagement, sometimes producing rapid summits and headline-driven breakthroughs. Supporters argue this approach can accelerate negotiations. Critics counter that durable peace usually requires buy-in from militaries, bureaucracies, and regional actors, not just top leaders. Both interpretations are grounded in historical precedent, and outcomes have varied depending on context. So what have the political reactions been? Reactions have divided along familiar lines. Some on the political right view the board as a way to restore US leadership and bypass what they see as ineffective global institutions. Some on the left worry that it could weaken multilateral norms, particularly if it sidelines the United Nations or reduces democratic oversight in international decision-making. The inclusion of leaders associated with active conflicts has further polarized reactions, with some governments declining participation on credibility grounds. And now what happens next? In the near term, the Board of Peace is expected to focus on Gaza-related efforts, with Trump suggesting it could expand to other conflicts if initial steps are seen as successful. At the same time, analysts highlight unresolved tensions, how the board fits legally alongside the UN, whether it can enforce outcomes, and whether it can gain broad international participation. In summary, assessments of the Board of Peace vary widely. Supporters emphasize speed, flexibility, and US leadership. Critics focus on enforcement, legitimacy, and institutional overlap. Its ultimate impact will depend less on rhetoric and more on participation, clarity of mandate, and whether it can produce agreements that endure beyond short-term political cycles. As with many diplomatic initiatives, its effectiveness will likely only become clear over time.